Thank you, Megan. And if you are on the computer, you should be able to select the language interpretation option also right at the bottom of the Zoom panel. And with that, I will pass it off to our interpreter, Emily, to give the instruction in Spanish.
Buenas noches y bienvenidos a todos. En un momentico vamos a empezar la presentación y tenemos interpretación en español. Si desea escuchar la reunión en español, por favor, ubícase al fondo de su ventana de Zoom y ahí puede escoger interpretación tras el icono del globo. Entonces, presionando sobre el icono del globo, se va a conectar con la opción de escoger o inglés o español. Si se está conectando con móvil, por favor empuje los tres puntitos y de ahí también va a acceder la función de interpretación a donde le va a ofrecer More, pues escoger el idioma preferido, pues listo o done. Y puede también silenciar el audio original si desea o se puede escuchar muy silenciosamente al fondo detrás del español. Si tiene cualquier pregunta, por favor, pregúntanos en el chat. Muchas gracias.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily. And as a reminder for the audience, we are in webinar mode, meaning that you will only be able to see the host and panelist, and the chat function is set so that you can chat only with the host and panelist. And so if you have any technical issues, you can send us a message. And if you have questions throughout, you can use the Q&A function.
Entonces, para
Oh.
comunicar, como estamos en webinar, se puede comunicar nada más con el patrocinador del webinar y no se puede comunicar entre los.
All right. So quickly, I'm Dira Johanoff, and I'll be your moderator for tonight. And here on this slide, we have the agenda for our webinar. And so we will be starting with introductions and then move on to project background. And then we'll hear about some results from our project. We'll hear from our Indigenous partner, and then a summary of our outreach engagement for the past year. We'll end with what's next for us and a Q&A from the audience. So again, if you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom panel. And so before we get started, I do want to take a moment to do a land acknowledgement and acknowledge that the Charles River Watershed resides on the occupied territory of the Massachusetts, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag tribes. And we acknowledge that a land acknowledgement is not enough, and that we continue to learn, grow, and listen to Native voices as we advocate for a resilient future. And if you're not familiar with CRWA or Charles River Watershed Association, we are an environmental advocacy organization. We were formed in 1965, and our mission is to protect, restore, and enhance the Charles River and its watershed through science, advocacy, and the law. And when we say watershed throughout this presentation, we're really talking about the area of land where rain that falls on that area will flow and end up in a common body of water. And so in this case, that's the Charles River. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see a map of the watershed and the river itself. The river is 80 miles long, and it flows downhill from north to south towards the Boston Harbor. And our watershed is just a little over 300 square miles and encompasses 35 towns and cities, with over 1 million residents who work and live and play in our watershed. And in our watershed itself, over 60% of residents are living in environmental justice neighborhoods. And as an organization, we like to take a watershed scale view because what happens upstream in a watershed doesn't stay upstream. All right, so on to tonight's speakers. You have already met me. Again, I'm Deirdre Johanneff. I'm the Senior Climate Resilience Associate with CRWA, and I support our Climate Resilience Program, which includes the project that we are talking about tonight. Our first speaker for tonight is Julie Wood, who's the Climate Resiliency Director at CRWA. She's a longtime member of the staff, having joined the organization since 2007. And Julie manages the Charles River Climate Compact and serves as the project manager for the Charles River Flood Model project, both of which you'll be hearing about tonight. Our second speaker is Indrani Ghosh. She's the Senior Technical Lead for Weston and Sampson. Indrani has more than 14 years of experience as a water resource engineer and as technical lead in climate change resiliency projects. She's worked with numerous municipalities and public agencies to model their impacts from coastal and stormwater flooding using the best available data. And she has extensive experience integrating climate projections into hydraulic and hydrologic models like the one you'll see today. Jenny Moonen is the Senior Project Manager and Engineering Team Leader for Weston and Sampson. She is a Massachusetts registered professional engineer with over 18 years of experience working with communities across New England to provide expertise around stormwater, wastewater, and drinking water. She also has expertise in comprehensive water resource planning and climate resiliency, and has a lot of experience in helping clients develop these kinds of projects. We'll also be hearing from Hartman Dietz, who is a Mashpee Wampanoag tribal member. He has been active in environmental and cultural stewardship for over 20 years. And this stewardship is based on his spiritual foundation and his native traditions that value the earth as a living being. He is also a traditional artist as well as a singer and dancer. And he is currently engaged in advocacy work with CRWA, advocating for the health and restoration of the Charles River and other campaigns around Native rights to access waterways. And last but not least, we'll also be hearing from Lee Munier, who's the program manager at Communities Responding to Extreme Weather, or CRWA. And she's been with them since 2018, both as organizers and coordinators in multiple different roles. And with her stellar team at CRWA, Lee coordinates much of the community engagement work related to the flood model project, with her eye and heart on ways to engage people throughout the watershed, authentically, equitably, and through mutual learning. All right, that was a lot. And you've probably heard from me enough, so I'm actually gonna hand it off to our first speaker, Julie.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dira. Yes, a lot of work there getting us started. And all right, excellent. A lot of work there getting us started and getting all the technical elements set up. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. We have these project updates about twice a year. I'm so glad to see so many of you here tonight. We are competing with a beautiful night. So also happy to see you if you are watching after the fact on YouTube. Welcome. So this is our semi-annual project update. We are going to provide you with the content of what we've been doing in the last 6 months. And then for those that want to do a deeper dive after this, we will be coming out with some additional materials and reports and online maps that you can dig into. So this is just the beginning of getting engaged. All right, so climate change isn't coming, it's here. I think if you're on this webinar, you probably have seen that in your own lives. In 2023, particularly in the summer, we saw some devastating storms in our watershed that caused significant damage, if not catastrophic. So what is flooding? Flooding is too much water in the same place at the same time. what we're going to be focusing on tonight is solutions. And those generally address that issue of too much water in the same place at the same time. So we can use our watershed to spread that water out. We can also use systems to change the timing of how fast that water is flowing downstream, so it's not all ending up in the same place at the same time. Flooding is a natural phenomenon. Rivers have natural floodplains, but because of how we've developed our modern society and, some poor development decisions that were made, decades ago when we just didn't know, and we certainly didn't know about climate change, now what we see is the impacts of the intersection of our built environment and flooding, causing, significant destruction, harm to our health, and it, as we all know, in severe cases can even be deadly. So we're really focusing on these flooding impacts and how we can prevent them. Some flooding, as I've said, is a natural phenomenon. And so as you'll hear, we have built that into our project. We have acknowledged that some amount of flooding is natural, and we may have to design around it, and we may have to accept it. And then some flooding we can work to prevent. Next slide. So just a bit more on climate change. Our storms are getting stronger. What you see here are what are called design storms. And just as the name implies, these are storms used to design things. You're going to hear us reference the 10-year storm a bit tonight. A 10-year storm means it has about a 10% chance of happening every year. So these design storms are just a certain amount of water that falls in a certain amount of time. And as you can see here, we've summarized in this nice cloud graphic some future projections out of Cornell that demonstrate how these design storms are likely to change. So these storms, which are once fairly infrequent, are becoming much more frequent. And that trend will continue as we head out to 2050 and 2070. Next slide. The project you're going to hear about tonight is a project of the Charles River Climate Compact, a regional collaboration for climate action. Our founding dates back to 2019. This work on this project dates back to about 2020. If you want to learn more about the Climate Compact, I invite you to visit our website, but there's our mission statement there. Next slide. Through this Climate Compact, we have developed what's called our Charles River Flood Model. This will be the focus of tonight's presentation. The flood model is a watershed scale computer simulation of what happens all across the watershed when it rains. And we can use these different storm scenarios, either actual storms that have occurred in the past or these design storms we were just talking about, run it through the model, and the model will show us where, when, how deep the flooding is that we can expect. We can also use it to test out nature-based solutions, and that's what we're actually going to be spending a good amount of our time talking about tonight. And this is a joint project, and you'll hear from many of our project partners tonight. Apologies from our Climate Compact rep who had a conflict tonight, but keep coming to these updates and you'll get to hear from all of us. Next slide. We present all our data and results available and open on the web. We don't try to hide anything. So this will all be, much of it is available on the web right now and will all be finalized and getting updated in the next few weeks. Next slide. And why do we need to work with so many communities on this? Why can't we just, do this kind of in one section? This kind of work really needs a watershed approach because as Dira referenced in the very beginning, the water is flowing from upstream to downstream. If you're not looking at the full picture, you are not going to have the full suite of tools in your toolbox available to you. So we need to look at the headwaters section where you might be available to store water. In the middle part of the watershed, perhaps a mix of storing water and moving water quickly to address that timing issue. By the time you get downstream in a watershed, really your hands are pretty tied. All you can do is kind of get that water out of the way and move it along. So if you're not looking at the whole area, you're not understanding the extent of the problem, and you're not including all the possible solutions. Next slide. So as I've referenced, we've been on this work since 2020. We have a variety of publications and a variety of data already available on the web. If you are someone who likes to dig in, please visit our website, and you can find all of this here, all of this there. Next slide. All right, before I hand it over to our partners at Weston and Sampson, I mentioned on a previous slide that some flooding is natural. So when we say we're trying to address flooding, really what are we trying to do? So we worked with the Climate Compact members to put some definitions to that for this phase of the work. So these are the 3 goals we have: preventing flooding at critical infrastructure, preventing flooding in environmental justice neighborhoods. And then also we measure the flooding by whether or not it is worse or better than flooding we'd expect to see today. So if we're accepting the present day flooding that we might experience in, say, a 10-year storm, that design storm, can we mitigate the future 10-year storm down to that present day 10-year storm and accept that as our accepted level of flooding that we will design around? All right, and with that, I will hand it over to Indrani.
Thank you, Julie. I will go ahead and share my screen. So bear with me for a moment, please. And can you let me know if you can see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. So Julie recapped really what a hydrologic and a hydraulic model is, but very quickly, just reminding the group that this model is really a mathematical or a computer simulation of where water flows, where it stores over time, how much flooding we see, how long it hangs around for. And this can be used to predict what happens under a variety of rainfall events. Plus, also, the model gives us a representation not just of where the flood risks are, but what we do for solutions and how those solutions can mitigate those flood risks. So as part of this year's work, we did some considerable modifications and updates to the flood model that included refining the flood model to add more bridges and culverts and stream crossings. Again, just a reminder that the flood model covers over 270 square miles of the upper and the middle Charles River watershed. We also used updated ground elevation terrain data to capture the best available information from LiDAR data, which is an improvement from the previous phase of the modeling. We also delineated the model with finer resolution data, so we were able to better capture how much flooding was occurring and where it was occurring. And through that process, we also did a recalibration and validation, because that is one of the most important steps to understand how well the model is doing or simulating with respect to observed data. So the 2 storms that we looked at for calibration and verification were the historic storms. One is the storm of March 2010. Some of you may remember that was a storm that caused a lot of flooding in the watershed, which is approximately, it dropped approximately 9 inches of rain over 60 hours. And then we verified the model with the storm from April 2018, which was approximately a 2-year, 24-hour design storm, as Julie explained. The calibration of the model was done by looking at observed stream flow data at 6 locations in the watershed, and those locations are shown here on the map on this slide. With that calibration, we were able to really well simulate the observed data in our model. And this is an example of the calibration data at the Medway gauge. We also checked similarly at the other 5 locations, and the model was calibrated and verified and is consistent with EPA standards and project requirements. Julie covered this with the cloud graphic earlier that was shown, that showed how the design storms and the future rainfall projections are likely to increase in the future. This table gives a snapshot of what those values are. And I know there are a lot of numbers on this table. This shows the 2, the 10, and the 100-year storms, and the rainfall that is expected to occur, that occurs today, which is present day, and how it's likely to increase in the future by 2050 and 2070. If there are 2 numbers that I'd like you to remember from this table, it's the 10-year storm of today, which is 5 inches, which is likely to be 7 inches by 2070, so additional 2 inches of rain, which can result in a lot of flooding. And then the 2-year storm of today, which is 3.3 inches, that is likely to be 4.5 inches, so over 1 inch of flooding, but that can also result in a lot more flooding. And that is what we have here to show. We ran those design storms through the flood model with all the updates that we made this year. And this slide shows a summary of those results, again, reported at the watershed scale. And what we're really seeing here is that we're expected to see over close to about 6,000 million gallons of additional runoff volume is likely to be generated from the 2070 10-year storm. And that also translates into additional 1,380 acres of area. Additional areas are likely to be flooded in the watershed from the 10-year storm of 2070 compared to what we see for a present-day storm. So that's really an exacerbation of the flood risks. And then we will now very quickly dive into some of the solutions that we evaluated for this phase of the project. So when we look at the flood risks, we saw that the flood risks and the manifestation of the flooding was very different at different portions across the watershed. We saw differences in total runoff volume. We saw peak flows being different. In some locations, the peaks were occurring earlier in the storm. There was a lag in the peak. And overall, the response to climate change was also very different across the watershed. And that led us to explore this idea of targeted solutions this phase. So we were looking at the results and we saw that the flood model and the flood in the watershed responds in different ways. And so if they are responding in different ways to the flood risks, it also implies that the solutions that we need to design need to be different at different locations of the watershed. And these targeted solutions need to be specific to the location based on the local characteristics of the watershed. It will also help us maximize the flood reduction benefit if we are able to come up with targeted or tailored solutions instead of one size fits all. And then these targeted solutions will help us accelerate flood mitigation planning. The types of strategies that we considered for this targeted solutions range into these 3 broad categories of reducing impervious cover, so looking at strategies of green infrastructure, pervious pavement, and depaving. Creating more pervious storage was the second category. We're looking at floodable parks, looking at constructed wetlands, and then creating more impervious storage, such as subsurface infiltration chambers, green streets, and so on. And then for each of these strategies, we did a mathematical exercise of looking at how much of each of these strategies would we need to implement, again, with the goal of not making the 2-year storm of the future any worse than the 2-year storm of today. And we looked at successive reductions of impervious cover, successive increase of pervious storage, and successive increase of impervious storage. And what we found in terms of results were really interesting. So this map here shows how the different portions of the watershed responded to these different strategies. The color in purple corresponds to that these portions of the watershed are most responsive to impervious area reduction. The orange color corresponds to that these portions of the watershed are most responsive to increasing of storage underneath pervious areas. And the green here corresponds to areas of the watershed that are most responsive to flood reduction by increasing storage underneath impervious areas. And then having gone through all of this targeted solutions approach, we then looked at how do we translate that information to look at watershed-wide effective strategies. In addition to the targeted solutions, which are captured here in scenario 2 and 3, the other effective watershed-wide solution we looked at was implementing what we call is the Watertown Rule. This is a policy, a stormwater policy that is in place for Watertown, which is effectively storing the 100-year storm of today, which is about 8.2 inches. And we looked at storing that on new development areas and redevelopment areas across the watershed. Scenario 2 was looking at implementing the 2 best solutions that we identified for each catchment in areas of the watershed that would be most responsive to those 2 solutions. And then scenario 3 was implementing the best solution that was identified for each catchment across the full watershed. And we're very happy to report this year that we were able to converge to a solution where we are able to make the future storm no worse than it is today. So if we just look at this figure here, this shows the baseline flooding on the far left for the 2-year storm of today, which is likely to increase significantly in the future. But having implemented that capturing of over 8 inches of rain with the Watertown Rule implemented across impervious areas and undeveloped, unprotected areas, we were able to mitigate that significantly. And then with applying the targeted solutions, we were able to mitigate that 100% with the best solution, and with the top 2 solutions implemented at select locations in the watershed, we were able to mitigate that flood volume by over 70%. And then we also saw significant, we see significant, some of the benefits decrease for the 10-year storm, but we still see significant improvements, and we're able to mitigate about 70% of that increase for the 10-year storm using the best solution across the watershed. It was also very important to look at what this means in terms of impacts to critical infrastructure. And this is what this slide is showing, how with the effective implementation of targeted solutions and more effective policies, we are able to mitigate the impacts on critical buildings and critical infrastructure, which affect your communities, prevent those locations from flooding. And really, as sort of a wrap of the flood mitigation strategies, we found that these tailored solutions can be really effective if they're designed appropriately. There is considerable flood mitigation can be achieved with these scenarios. And then there is spatial variability. And then what works in one community may not exactly work in the same way in another community, but we do need to address more aggressive local stormwater policies to make flood reduction more effective. And with that, I will hand it over to Jenny to speak about some of the nature-based solutions that we explored at sites.
Yeah, so we zoomed in on certain areas. Julie has kind of mentioned this before. We looked at priority project sites, and that's an individual site submitted by a community. It might be like a ball field or a sort of little area of a town or city. And then we also looked at what are called priority impact areas. And those are going to be portions of the watershed, like a mini watershed, if you would think of it, like a catchment area that covers one or more towns. And those, next slide, please. Those priority projects went through a whole process of selection. We developed a methodology, collected project ideas from communities throughout the watershed, and then applied that methodology to select those projects. And projects that rose to the top for a number of reasons are those that actually implement a green solution, have public support, maybe are a regional project that cross community boundaries, benefit EJ neighborhoods or other priority populations, and things that can be done in the near future reasonably, right? Can get permits, have minimal utility conflicts, and have community support. We also went through a prioritization process to select impact areas. This is a little different, but again, we're still thinking about comparative criteria across all of the catchments in the watershed, whether the projects were regional, how they addressed current or projected flood damage, it mitigated flooding for critical facilities, and how much they impacted environmental justice areas, et cetera. And so with that, we have, for this last year, I worked on 2 priority project sites and 2 priority impact areas. The first priority site is, next slide, please. Oh, excuse me. And before I move on, I want to talk quickly about what is a concept design, so everyone's sort of clear. Developed concepts for these priority sites and impact areas. Concepts consider project goals. They have basic site information. They reflect community needs and desires. This year, we had a lot of dialogue with the municipalities on what they liked and didn't like, what was feasible. But they're not plans that you could build yet, right? These don't have exact elevations or slopes. They don't reflect the soil conditions we need to consider. It's not precise, right? So more work is required. So Dedham submitted the Barnes Memorial Park. It's a town-owned and main recreational site. And what we did is we identified number of solutions at this site. So that includes restoring wetlands, and that means actually, planting with species that are appropriate for wetlands areas, renaturalizing space. This is space that's actually currently turf grass, and that would be replacing that with native species and pollinators. We created a design that includes sort of an overflow area for the current stream that's there, and that would provide more area for floodwaters to expand into. We also looked at expanding the parking and creating bioretention to deal with that runoff and adding tree canopy. This project gives a great result in reduction in flooding. There's up to a 13% reduction in flooding in the entire subcatchment. By 2070, there's still a 10% decrease in flooding for the 2-hour event, and up to approximately 10% and 8% reduction in total runoff volume during the baseline in 2070 10-year 2-hour event. So good benefits in this area, and it keeps the place usable and playable, and recreation areas are so important for many reasons in communities. The next area we looked at was Alderbrook in Needham, and this is an area of town that starts with a reservoir and flows directly into the Charles. Has some facilities, some culverts, and a stream system. We have a number of practices here, including wetlands restoration I previously mentioned, restoring a gravel lot, creating bioretention basins, daylighting streams and restoring streams that are degraded, removing a building, reducing impervious cover, adding bioretention basins, and even thinking about a resilience forest succession planning, as well as some culvert assessment and improvements. And this project gave a great reduction in flooding, 70% in the volume in the 2-hour event, and late century that really is still 63%. So that's a great benefit to this catchment. And during the baseline 10-year 2-hour event, the subcatchment had a 61% reduction in flooding, which by 2070, that reduction is still 56%. So we saw really great benefits here. Looking at the impact areas really briefly as well, 2 impact areas, the upper watershed included an area that's in Norfolk and Wrentham, and the lower watershed included an area in Dedham and Boston. We explored many nature-based solutions throughout these catchments, considering parcel availability and ownership, space, impervious cover, subsurface conditions available with mapping, flow patterns and pathways, and came up with numerous ideas for these 2 areas and shared those with the communities for feedback. So those included things like bioretention and depaving, adding porous pavement, storing water subsurface, adding trees, and even managing invasives and restoring streams. I'm going to zoom into the Norfolk catchment and just talk a little bit more about what these solutions can do to reduce flooding. The 17 nature-based solutions in the site could eliminate approximately 13 acres of impervious surface, which is a 5% reduction in the area and does reduce flooding a bit. But we had to actually take a 2nd-tier approach, and we did an experiment where we looked at what would it take to get to the 42% reduction that we do need to achieve to meet that targeted reduction that Indrani had talked about? We played a thought exercise looking at porous parking. So what if you replaced each parking spot, instead of it being normal pavement, it's porous? And what we found is in this catchment, about 3,900 pervious parking stalls would be needed to get to that reduction. The images on the right are examples of porous that could be pavers or, porous pavement. There's about 3,000 residential properties. Plenty of those probably have more than one car parking. So, I mean, on the long term, if everyone replaced their driveway with porous, could do a lot here. But if you also zoom into the downtown area, where there's the businesses and all the parking spaces, if you added quite a bit more storage there in like subsurface, which is the image on the lower right, or storage, you could really meet what this catchment needs to reduce flooding by 2070 and beyond. So with that, I think we're going back to Julie. Am I right?
Thank you, Jenny. Excellent. Yes, you can take your screen share down. All right, excellent. And now we're going to hear next, before we go back to our slides, we are going to hear from Hartman Dietz. Hartman, we already introduced you at the beginning, so you can just take it away. Thank you.
Okay. Well, yeah, kui kwasan taswish Hartman Dietz, nitmas mased, ni masipi wampanak. So yeah, my name's Hartman Dietz. I'm from Mashpee. I'm a Mashpee Wampanoag, and yeah, I have to sort of think on the bigger picture here as a Wampanoag person who's been here 12,000 years, or not myself, but my folks, my people. There was a time when my ancestors arrived here, coming from the south as the glaciers receded, and we were the first human beings to walk on the earth here. And at that point in time, they said the glacier stood maybe a mile tall on top of, and you could walk on the dry ground out to what we now call Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket, the Elizabethan Islands. These were a part of the mainland. And now, of course, there are quintessential islands that, are a part of what we think of when we think of Massachusetts. These are places that are often to the water, but they weren't always. There was a time when they were connected, and the coastlines change, the waters change, the riverbanks change, and change is inevitable. And this is the truth. And so we have to stop thinking about our pitiful little teeny time here as human beings. We're not even the blink of an eye in the time of the earth. So things are so constantly changing in the scale of earth that we are really, minuscule. And yet we've had a huge impact. Over about 20% of the earth's surface at this point has been impacted by human development. And that's a huge portion, considering, that as a species, we've only inhabited the earth but a brief time, and that most of that has happened within the past 150 years or so, since the Industrial Revolution. So we've been capable of making drastic changes in the world that we live in. So, these things have to be considered, and have to consider not only the fact that we've been able to make these changes, but that we're capable of changing the world for the better, and capable of changing the world not only so that it functions for us as human beings, but for all life. So we've developed 20% of the Earth's surface, and that's a lot. That's 1/5. And there's this race to develop the rest of it. One of the things I think about when we start talking about flooding and the impact it's going to have is the fact that we continuously mark areas and lots for more and more development, that's oftentimes along the edges of the water, because this is the prime real estate where people want to have their beautiful homes. They want to have their nice office buildings. They want to develop close to the water because the water is attractive. We are drawn to it as human beings. It's the source of all life. But we have to give the water itself space. We have to stop developing next to the water. We have to stop developing in flood zones. It's really important because these spaces are going to change. That's the truth. And we can do our best to mitigate it, and we can do our best to plan around it, which we should do, but we can't stop it. And that's the fact of the matter. So we have to plan accordingly, that if there's a low area that we know stands a chance of being underwater in years to come, just don't develop. And this means that we have to take on some forces of politics and economy, but it can be done, and we have to start working together to do that across a lot of fronts. There's been so much money this year approved for war and conflict, hundreds of billions of dollars that have been slated for emergency spending, and yet the idea that we are approaching an emergency with the climate and the changes that are coming with it, that we need to slate spending in the same way, it just seems lost on the political powers that be. It's going to take a lot of investment. It's going to take a lot of resources to make these changes, to
Oops, it looks like Hartman might have frozen. Was all right. Yeah, looking like we lost Hartman, unfortunately. All right, we will try and get him back. He had another he was joining us straight from another commitment. So on the road, and we appreciate that. But sometimes it leads to technical troubles. All right. So with that, we will hand it over to Lee Munier.
Hi, good evening, everybody. So I guess, I think before I even begin, just want to give some space here. One, to allow what Hartman just shared to just seep into ourselves. And also, I know a lot of what's been shared thus far this evening has been a lot of technical information. You're going to be dreaming tonight about culverts and bioretention basins, and as Hartman lifted up this question of, how are we changing the world for the better, and not just thinking short term but long term. So giving that a little bit of that space, and then lifting up that this is actually where CRWA steps in, right? So we're thinking a lot about the stories of stormwater, flooding, the land, and where CRWA has been very active in this project. Communities Respond to Extreme Weather, and the acronym CRWA, is offering some facilitation around the stories, right? So how do we help tell these technical stories of stormwater and flooding to the community in ways that are accessible? How do we get this information to you all in ways that's digestible, accessible, and meaningful, right? Which is going to be a little different across the watershed, similar to what others here have mentioned this evening. Geographically across the watershed, solutions need to be different, and our approaches to connecting with people have to be different as well. And then flipping that, right? So CRWA is also integral here in helping to receive your stories and get them back to some of the leaders and decision makers, and especially the planners in some of your municipalities who are part of the Charles River Climate Compact, especially. So just thank you again. Really glad to be here with you all. I will start off briefly by just mentioning who CRWA is. I'll talk very briefly again about some of the ways we reach people in this phase of the project. And I really just want to focus a good portion of our time on what we heard from you all. So just CRWA, Communities Respond to Extreme Weather. Our major focus is on really accessing a network of local leaders to increase climate resilience in communities with a focus on extreme weather preparedness. We do a lot of that work through a broader hubs network that's national, building out a climate resilience hubs network, and then also engaging in some of those nature-based solutions projects ourselves. I wear a couple different hats here, as I'm sure many of you all do as well here in the webinar space tonight. One of those is also with depaving, a term that Indrani mentioned earlier. And so how do we, so in addition to being here in these spaces, engaging with communities about what you care about, we also feel very connected to being active in the community in meaningful physical projects when we can. So Jared, slide, thanks. So just starting here with, so listening, when we're out engaging with watershed communities, what are the kinds of spaces where we have shown up to listen and connect with you all this phase, and how have we done that? So one is just what has been typical over the last few years and is a fantastic space to connect with people has been watershed events and festivals. We've continued to go back to some spaces and then engaged in several new ones this phase. And then one that we're super excited about that is fairly new in this phase, and then we're actually going to carry this over into the next one as well, is engaging with workshops where we can have more targeted, slowed down conversations with people, focusing on different populations, climate vulnerable and environmental justice populations especially. So we're thinking about youth at schools. That's a photo you're seeing there of youth at Minuteman Tech in Lexington, which serves students from all over different cities and towns in the watershed, reaching elders in the community, having meaningful conversations through councils on aging and senior centers, and then thinking also about a lot of people who live in housing developments that are right on the river, right? People who are experiencing flooding in real time. And then another way that CRWA was very grateful to be involved is CRWA did also facilitate some focus groups, which was really about targeting specific local leaders and bringing them in from across different sectors to hear from people about, gaining wisdom about what are the most effective ways we can be reaching people in the community. Who are we missing? How do we reach them? And some groups, other groups that were involved were groups like Meadowscaping for Biodiversity, municipal leaders from Hopkinton, Hartman, who you just met from Mashpee Wampanoag, members of ACE. And then I do also want to just continue to celebrate, and I know Emily's here tonight, so just a shout out to Emily for providing Spanish interpretation. So members of the team at Rosetta Languages, right? The way into conversation first is going to be through our language. If we can't reach people in the languages of their heart, right? Their fluency language, then what are we doing? So we want to make sure we're continuing to do that meaningfully. Next slide. So just quickly, we just want to talk in terms of the quantitative. So what are some of the things that we heard from, where were some of the spaces that we were this phase, and what did we hear from people? So as you saw in the last slide, we attended 9 community events. We facilitated 5 different types of workshops. We were really excited to hear from more than 500 people at these different events. And then we had almost 500 different votes for nature-based solutions, which is exciting. We had a board, which was a way into conversation with people. And especially for kiddos, right? You want to have something tactile where they can learn about some of these concepts with images. So just want to lift up some of the things we're hearing from community that when you think about nature-based solutions, what are people caring about? I just want to say trees always win, hands down. Adults, kids, everybody loves trees, wants more of them. And this is something consistent across the watershed. We also, second runner-up was more urban green spaces, thinking again, especially at some of those downstream communities where there's a lot of paved surface and more dense living. And then also there was a deep interest in floodable parks. My guess is this is also where kids were probably instrumental. They saw the word parks and were like, yes, more of that. Next slide. So yeah, so in terms of something I do also want to just lift up as well, something that was pretty we can be really proud of, and especially now that we've been in this project for several phases, is it's given us an opportunity to go back to the same spaces over and over again, which I cannot lift up enough how important that is, to not just go and do a one-off thing with the community, but to show up over and over again, because what that allows us is the opportunity to slow down and take stock of who we might even be missing that first time around. And then we can prepare and return again next time to have more meaningful conversations. So with that, just want to lift up here a couple of things that we were able to create was that nature-based solutions board that I mentioned in English and Spanish. which had visuals, right? There's one type of language to speak to people, different written languages, and then also multilingual posters. So we would have one, that photo there is of me apparently in winter garb in the middle of spring, but with an English poster and then a full out Chinese, traditional Chinese poster. So really the importance of having these kind of like pop-in visuals in the languages where that you want to reach people. And we've had multiple people from different community groups and climate groups and municipal staff reach out to us during the event and then afterwards for requests for how to create those materials and to use some of our templates. Next slide. Great. So I did want to just lift up, who have we been learning from throughout this process? So I just want to celebrate some of those partners and people that we have had continuing relationships with, and then some that have been new as of this phase. Waltham Land Trust is a hyper-local organization working on green space issues in Waltham, Mass. So we've continued to have relationships with them. Mass Audubon, we've been working regionally on conservation efforts. And then they also do run a nature center down on Magazine Beach in Cambridge. So we've been a partner with them for events. And then I also want to lift up especially the town of Medway. So of course, with each phase, we continue to build relationships with municipal planners and municipal staff. And I just want to give a shout out to Medway as just being a continuous collaborative partner and just being very excited to work with CRU when we've been coming to their events every year, Medway Pride Day specifically, and really just modeling meaningful municipal, not even just meaningful, I mean, joyful, creative community collaborations. So so just anyways, I want to give a shout out to them. And then some of the new partners, as I mentioned, Minuteman Tech, Mothers Out Front West Roxbury, some of the councils on aging, we did not connect with them in previous phases, but as we're doing more workshops, we look forward to continue working with them. And then some residents at a housing development called The Mill in Waltham. And then, like I mentioned, whereas those first couple of phases, we were not necessarily able to reach meaningfully some specific non-English speaking communities, but in this phase we were, because we could go back to those same spaces again with more resources and including interpreters who were quite versed in Mandarin and Cantonese. Next slide. So I do want to just take this opportunity to just share, in addition to some of that quantitative, the numbers, right? What are some of the things that you all were witnessing? What are some of the wisdom that we're hearing from communities across the watershed? And that's through some things we were capturing on some boards that we had available, and then also through direct conversations, both while tabling and in our workshops. So we were seeing some things that were trends across the watershed. So I want to lift up here, and then also things that were specific to particular communities. Within the experiences bucket. All right, so what are some of the experiences of communities across the watershed? A couple of things that we were hearing consistently, and this means across geography. It didn't matter whether you lived in urban, suburban, rural, whether you were an elder or a youth. When we went in and asked people, what do you think about what your town is doing, your city is doing? Often, and so just municipal planners take alert. A lot of people are still saying, I have no idea what my city or town is planning. They might be doing a lot, but I wouldn't know. And then they were able to offer some ideas that we were able to funnel back to planners, right, of ways that they think they could be reached more meaningfully. In addition to that, extreme heat, more days indoors with air conditioning, that seems to be, regardless of whether people are vulnerable to the heat or not, this is something people are experiencing or either uncomfortable with or concerns about health. I also do want to lift up in terms of specific communities, some of those experiences that were unique to what youth are sharing and then also what elders in the community. And I want to lift these up too, because these do connect back to the wisdom of different populations. So, some of the teens that we worked with, they were saying, I can't go skiing anymore, which can sound very trivial. And I remember working with the students and they were sort of poking at each other and like, oh, you're so privileged to be able to say that. And sure, that's okay. And at the same time, we wanted to really just take pause there and say, no, but this is also the way in which you are connecting with the land. This is the way that you are witnessing the impacts. And so if we don't capture that story, we can't really reach you meaningfully, right? So that was really important. And then also lifting up the ways in which elders are going to be so instrumental here, right? So many elders in the community have talked about the dramatic changes that they're witnessing in one place across time. And one was around changes in nature sounds, right? Like a mismatch, certain sounds of birds happening earlier or than they're supposed to because of migration patterns changing and whatnot. I'll just quickly also just mention a couple of the concerns that we were hearing. So across the watershed, people are lifting up, which is amazing, right? Because it speaks to compassionate people across the geography. People are really concerned about the ways in which flooding and other climate change impacts are already and are over time going to be more harmfully, more intensely impacting people who are already being displaced or experiencing health disparities. And then what's interesting as far as concerns in that are specific to with specific communities, neighborhood reputation was a big one when we talk to people in the suburbs, right? Like, I'm concerned about changing my lawn and turning it into a quote unquote messy garden. And then in urban communities, we heard a lot about gas leaks and the ways that those are impacting the urban tree canopy. Lastly here, I just want to, because I'm making note of time, as far as some of the responses that we also heard from the community, just want to celebrate. We're out in the community over these past few years, and so many climate resilience groups are burgeoning, and those are made up of volunteers from the community. So that's y'all. So those are emerging over time. A lot of people are calling for more support around what they can do at home for transforming their land into rain gardens, depaving. And then community members are also lifting up ways that they want to see their municipal planners more responsive. And one way in which is to make sure we're not looking at this linearly, right? Acknowledging that it's not just coming up with solutions that are, hey, it's a flood and it's always going to be massive floods increasing over time. But some years it's going to be a drought. Some it's a flood. Some years we have storms, some we have none. And then the last thing I just want to bring up as far as a really big concern, and Hartman really hit home with this, was around development. We heard this over and over again on different levels. So people were lifting up concerns about land development in terms of building on top of wetlands and in flood zones, right? People are like, why are we still doing this? We have the science, and are noting their frustration. Another is just a deep concern. People are heartbroken and sharing this with us around the clear cutting mature trees and the narrative that developers or even municipal, if it's public land, oh, we can just replace those trees. And people are concerned about that. And then thinking a lot about the culture as well, right? So how is what people are witnessing indicative of a change in culture and in ways that people are deeply concerned about and potentially fearful of, right? So, and it's quite founded fears, right? It's maxing out lots. It's knocking down small houses and people building out lots to the max, putting in mini mansions. So I just want to lift these up too, because often there is a narrative around just people being resistant to change. And that is a thing as well. But in this case, what we're hearing are quite founded concerns about changes people are witnessing, right? That do connect back to culture, do connect to grief of change. And then because it's something related to development, a lot of people are also navigating their own sort of powerlessness or frustrations around not being able to make change or be involved in the decision-making around this. Next slide. So last thing I just want to lift up here is just looking forward to the next phase. So because of all the things that we're hearing from y'all, we're thinking about new spaces that we can be in, and then the spaces we will return to. How can we continue to do that more meaningfully? So we will continue to return to some events, like I mentioned, Matt's Audubon Magazine Beach is a Nature in the City event every multiple times a year, so we'll go there. We're going to go to Franklin this year, which we have not been to, in their Harvest Festival. And I just want to lift up, we will continue to do our workshops with people, because really it's those spaces that allow us to slow down, to really explain and answer questions, allow for insights to emerge, allow for us to say, I don't know, and for others in the community who are present to be able to share their insights in response to questions. And that can't happen as much in the tabling setting as it can in the workshops. And just want to celebrate as well some new and continued partnerships. Thank you again to Rosetta. Thank you to Emily here tonight. And then to some other groups, Spark Kindness and the Franklin Downtown Partnership. We look forward to hopefully, connecting with you all in this next phase more meaningfully. And just, want to say thanks. So if you're learning more, please check us out. And again, just want to lift up, if you have any local projects in your community you think we should prioritize, please reach out to me, reach out to Julie, reach out to others in this call tonight. And we will gladly talk more. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lee. Excellent. All right, we're coming into the home stretch. Hopefully folks are starting to see how this is all coming together. We gather as much input from the community, as much input from our team, put it into our technical work. And then it informs our path forward. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to invite you to put your questions in the Q&A while I'm speaking, because we're just about to get to that Q&A period portion of our webinar tonight. All right, so we have some recommendations to share with you that you can think about and then provide feedback on. So one of the things we were looking for was that pathway to reducing flooding, or pathway to meeting these goals that I presented at the beginning and have on the side of this slide as well. So we have two possible pathways that we wanted to present. We have a survey available where you guys can let us know what you think. So one would be using the Watertown rule, which Indrani referenced. This is the City of Watertown's stormwater regulation that requires properties, when they develop or redevelopment, to store that present-day 100-year storm on site. So this shifts a lot of the burden onto private development and redevelopment. On Pathway 1 would also include local and regional systems to address sites where, to address sites or public realm areas that would reduce flooding in EJ communities and at critical infrastructure sites. There may also need to be some regional system to address sites where storing large volumes is technically infeasible. So Pathway 1 has those three elements. Pathway 2 is what we're calling the Targeted Solutions Plus. And this uses the best single solution in that catchment scenario that you saw earlier tonight. So we're using the best solution per catchment all throughout the watershed. We would also need considerable public investment in projects that reduce flooding in EJ communities and critical infrastructure. So a little more of that in Pathway 2 than in Pathway 1. Next slide to compare those a bit briefly. So what are the benefits of 1 versus 2? 1, the flooding impacts of today will not get worse into the future. That's what our model has shown. Pathway 2, a little less close, but a little more work to get there. Both have some potential to prevent flooding at critical infrastructure in EJ communities, depending on where site-specific projects could go. Pathway 1 does align pretty well with the way existing stormwater regulations and general stormwater management is happening. Pathway 2 is a diversion. We don't usually say, well, do this in this part of town, that in that part of town, this much is required down here, that much is required up here. It's not typically how our local governance works. However, there could be efficiencies by doing exactly what's needed in exactly the right spot. Certainly Pathway 1 shares the cost with the private sector considerably. Potential to do that in Pathway 2 as well. Both have numerous co-benefits. Prioritizing land protection and conservation, not as much in Pathway 1. If we're really looking to develop and redevelopment to help us get there, that might mean we might see a lot of development. Requiring public support, everything, of course. Next slide. And then we made some specific individual recommendations coming out of this plan. So we are encouraging communities to consider adopting the Watertown rule or something equivalent. We know that will get us there. We have also learned that we need broad action, aggressive action, and we need to start now. We don't really have time to wait. We encourage folks to lean into the co-benefits. So if you're building a large green stormwater infrastructure system, maybe it won't fill up this decade. Maybe it won't fill up until a storm hits next decade. It still has benefits right away, as soon as that's in the ground. Communities might consider taking these variable actions, consider matching what is best with where it's best. And then we're also looking to the state to explore governance structures for regional climate adaptation. That has been done in other sites. What's come out of the model here is what will be effective, would absolutely benefit from that kind of governance structure where you could match projects with where they're needed and have resources that could be spent easily across multiple town boundaries. And then identify and implement individual projects in partnership with residents and resident groups. We shared some of those tonight, the Barnes Memorial Park and the Alderbrook area in Needham. Those are things we can get going on right now, again, that will have immediate improvements and help us adapt to this flooding issues that are coming. As much as we can, we love to hear those ideas from you. So I know Lee already mentioned that. There will be a survey going out right after that, where if you have an idea, you know something that's going on, even if it's not going on, it's just your idea, let us know. So what's next? Check out our updated data on the online map viewer. We're gonna have a new story map coming at the end of the month, so keep checking back. We'll also have our updated flood mitigation plan finalized at the end of the month. And if you sign up for this webinar, we will send you an email when that is available. We're doing additional modeling this fall. We have received some feedback that while you love nature-based solutions, you would also like to see us look at gray infrastructure. We hear you. We are going to do that. That's coming. And then more site identification and design. So all the impact and input and feedback you have is welcome and needed. All right, and let us shift to Q&A. I'll turn it back to you, Dira.
Thanks, Julie. All right, I already see some questions in the chat, and so I am going to first make sure all of our panelists are spotlighted, and we can start with one of the questions in the chat that came in. One is just a quick, I guess someone put in the chat that they're interested in working with CRWA. So Lee, if you want to provide your information, or you could also email Lee, but you could also provide your information in the chat. A question that came in is, does CRWA reach out to the development community as well as, looks like, Rotary clubs and realtors when we're thinking about who to engage with? So Lee, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can very briefly and honestly say, no, we have not talked with the development community as CRWA. Now, again, I can work other hats here and say, like, in other realms, we've worked with Rotary Club, you know, talking about, I live in Somerville, so riding the line between the watersheds, and have done a lot here talking with Rotary clubs, and then developers around, you know, committing to native plants, weaving in tiny forests and certain kinds of development. So I bring that to CRWA like as an individual, but that's not something that we as a collective have done as much. So yeah, reaching out to the development community specifically. So thank you for naming that. And I can make a note. And whoever did put that in the chat as a question, Julia, feel free, if you have thoughts on how to do that, you're welcome to put that in the chat. And I will also put my direct email in case you want to reach out.
Great, thank you. And another question in the chat. This person says, Marcia says, I live in Watertown along the river. I'm curious how the level of the river is managed. I notice it is lower when rain is forecast. How does that work? I think a lot of people in the past have had this question as well. So Indrani or Julie, if you want to take it on.
Yeah, I can start, and Julie, feel free to add, please. But so the portions of the portions of the city of Watertown that are downstream of the Watertown Dam are controlled actually by the operations of the New Charles River Dam. So between the Watertown Dam and the New Charles River Dam, that is the lower Charles River Basin. That portion of the Charles River Basin is actually not part of the model that we discussed in the meeting today, but the portion of the Watertown that is downstream of the Watertown Dam that is maintained by the operations of the New Charles River Dam. And when a rain is in forecast, the Charles River Basin is held to specific elevations. And so the dam actually, the sluice gates are open and the basin level is lowered such that the water in The lower basin can drain and make more space for the rainwaters to fall when a rain is forecast, and so that we see less flooding. So that's really part of the flood operations that is maintained at the New Charles River Dam, that's operated by Department of Conservation and Recreation, DCR, and hence we see a lowering of the river levels when rain is in forecast. Julie, anything I missed?
Well, I would just like to add that while we did not talk about it tonight, we have investigated that exact strategy elsewhere in the watershed. And where you might have an impoundment that is infeasible to remove for whatever reason, it can actually be a potentially very effective flood solution to use a pond, lower the level, make more room for storage, let it fill up. And also if you have a real-time control, you're able to really respond to that timing issue. So you can hold it, let a little bit go if the rain dies down, and then, you know, hold that level again. So it's a solution we're looking at in other parts of the watershed.
Great, thank you. And then I'll take a question from the Q&A, I think going back to you, Lee. Could you share more about how the CRU workshops are implemented? And is there any way that folks can get access to some of the templates we use during the workshops?
Yeah, so I think the simpler one to respond to is the second one. So in terms of the templates, it's I think as simple as just you can reach out to our team and we can share them with you. We were just having this, Dear and I were having this conversation the other day about like how to share things meaningfully, and what things we feel like need credit or not. And it really is just coming back to like, if anybody sees anything that we're doing and wants and thinks it's would work for them too, we want to be able to share it out as much as we can. So it's really as simple as just reach out to us and we'd be happy to get you whatever version of it works for you, whether you want something full or some sort of bare bones version of our resources. And I know we were talking about, you know, posters is what we had up there, but then we also have a lot of different kinds of information flyers and stuff that we also have, and trifolds with preparedness kits in them in different languages, et cetera, too, that we also make available at our tables, too. So, and in terms of the workshops, yeah, I mean, where I think it really begins is where we're being, I guess, two things. One, where we're being asked to go, and then also thinking about what we have access to information-wise, where we know that people are more vulnerable and reaching out. So, as mentioned, you know, we talked about an example is like some of the housing developments along the river, especially one in Waltham. And that was us reaching out to them directly. We did not necessarily have direct relationship, but what we did was listen to others in the community that are delivering lots of different kinds of community services, and then asking them, you know, who are the people that we need to connect with and have these more meaningful and direct conversations with. So it could be, again, people who are directly impacted by flooding, and it's about getting people particular resources for emergent situations. And then also thinking again about people that we need to connect with who maybe are not, are often, you know, marginalized or not as, or neglected in a lot of the decision-making conversations, and making sure we reach them. In terms of the content of the workshops themselves, I mean, that's a collaboration between our team and CRWA. So thinking again about how can we get across some of the technical information through story, and then you know, really break it down as much as we can with the workshop. So it's not just presenting with people; it's really a focus on dialogue, and then some pieces of it, especially in this next phase. I'll say we want to do a lot more that's interactive. A lot of the workshops we may end up doing are going to be like a part 2, going back to connect with people and weaving together both like, here's updates of what's happening with flooding in your community and getting feedback on nature-based solution projects from them. And then also, again, while we're here, can we engage in something that is interactive, that is about neighbor-to-neighbor resilience building while we're here with you, right? So how can we leave the people that we're in dialogue with stronger and more connected with each other? So those are the kinds of activities that we will also engage in with people before we leave them at the end of a workshop. And always open to ideas. So again, feel free to reach out either through the chat here or again through email to share.
Great, thanks so much, Lee. All right, next question that came up in the chat. Let me find it. Okay, is there any data on how much having mature trees on a piece of land reduces flooding, both surface runoff and subsurface water movement? So I don't know if Indrani or Jenny, either of you want to take that.
Yeah, Dira, I'm trying to pull up that stat because I actually had it recently from research that we did, and unfortunately my PowerPoint is crashing. I do have the number and I'd love to share it out with the group. Can we come back to this question in a moment?
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you.
The other question that came in the chat, how will the removal of the Watertown Dam, which I know is planned eventually, change the lower basin management? And will the basin then be extended to the Waltham Moody Street Dam, which, if folks remember, the extent of our flood model is up to Watertown Dam?
Yep, thank you for that question. It is an important question. However, I will not be able to provide a very specific answer to that because the removal of the Watertown Dam and its impacts on the lower basin will need to be evaluated separately. And I am and that will be something that will be undertaken as part of that project, which, you know, that would be certainly something that we would expect that DCR may do when that project is being undertaken. But again, as a reminder, our project sort of extends upstream of the Watertown Dam, but it is a good question to consider in terms of what would happen with the removal of the Watertown Dam. And I think it is fair to say that the impacts of that will be evaluated as part of that project.
Yeah, absolutely. I can jump in a little bit there. DCR is doing that. So with the dam removal, you basically build a mini H&H model that Indrani introduced us to how those work. So you basically build it for the stretch of river that would be impacted by, you know, either the dam being there or the dam being removed. So DCR has hired a consultant to do some of that and is working on some more of that. And I think there is actually going to be a public meeting on that project relatively soon. And CRWA will definitely be helping to propose that. So that would be a great, hopefully you come to that meeting and that will be a great question.
Great. And I think, Jenny, you have some answers to the previous questions about mature trees and its relation to runoff reduction.
Yeah, there's a US Department of Agriculture publication that talks about this. And for a mature large diameter tree, which they, I think, consider 12 inches or diameter, can capture and retain as much as 332 gallons of water per storm event. I can find the citation, but I think that's a good sort of overview of the question from a reputable source. So it does reduce quite a bit of flooding on a localized spot. I mean, that's quite a bit of water per storm.
Great. Thanks so much for finding that. All right. I don't see any new questions in the Q&A box or in the chat. If anyone has any last minute questions, please put them in the chat or Q&A. You've also probably seen a lot of links being shared by Megan in the chat. All of those links are related to things that folks have brought up in the presentation, and also a survey link, which should also pop up for you once we end the webinar. But maybe I'll give it a couple more seconds for anyone else to put in a question. And then maybe I'll go to this slide so that you can also see Julie and I's email on the screen. Feel free to reach out to us if you do have any thoughts or questions. And I think Megan will put in the chat some links relevant to subscribing to our newsletter or seeing our watershed model. And this webinar was obviously recorded, and we will be uploading it to our YouTube page. So if you happen to lose the email or don't see an email come in from us about the recording, you can easily find all of our past webinars as well on our YouTube page at CRWA2. All right, I don't see any more questions coming in. I do have a note here from Lee to let Lee know that she did see you at the Charles River Dragon. Is it a dragon race at Magazine Beach? Oh, her art piece of the Charles River Dragon at Magazine Beach. Yes, that was really amazing. So any way we could incorporate that to more of CRW's work, I think that would be amazing. All right, so it's 6:23. I think we can start closing out. Just want to say thank you again for everyone for joining us. We hope we can see some of you all in our future webinars, and also hear back from you all in our survey form. Julie, did you have any other?
Thank you all. Hope to see you soon.
All right.
Thank you to my fellow panelists.
Yes, thank you to all our speakers. Thank you, everyone.
You're welcome.
Thank you all.
Thanks all. You will.